Welcome all of you to the Engineer Research and Development Center, and more specifically the Information Technology Lab, part of ERDC. First time to Vicksburg for a lot of folks, as I think you said, yeah. So, wow. So I've been here since, my background, I've been here since 1983. Graduated straight out of Mississippi State University, a native Mississippian. You can hear the voice just like Patty's. Grew up in South Mississippi, graduated in '83, civil engineering. Started here straight out of school. I didn't even know what the Army Corps of Engineers was. Never even heard of it before. Thought you had to join the Army. You know, it's just crazy. But if anybody remembers the 80s, I know we're a lot of young people in the room here, but it was hard to find a job back then. I mean, it was like no jobs, and I had all these great grades, no job offers except for the Corps of Engineers. So I took it, and the rest is history. So, and I did leave for a few years, as Simon said. I left in the mid-90s to go teach at Auburn University for just about 3 years. Any War Eagles out there? No? Oh, there's one. There's one in every crowd. But I went to school actually at Southern Mississippi in Hattiesburg, where Brett Favre was quarterback at one time. And then Mississippi State, a couple of degrees there. I went to University of Texas. The Corps of Engineers sent me off to University of Texas to get my PhD in the early 90s. And then again, I taught at Auburn, and I'm here. So I got a lot of university connections. My daughter, by the way, is going to graduate next month from Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi. That's that other Southeastern Conference school. It's kind of a rival to Mississippi State. Hey, she got a full scholarship. I got over that 4 years ago. She's doing good. Chemical engineering, and wants to go on and become a medical doctor. So I've been here a long time. You'll see people all over the place. How many ERDC folks do we have here in the room, by the way? I know we got, there we go, yeah. Ambassadors for ERDC all over the place. And thank you all for being here. You're going to see their passion and their commitment for what we do every day. I mean, God blessed me to come to this place, really, because I didn't know anything about it back in 1983. But whatever leads you here, you tend to get addicted and connected to what we get to do for the nation every day. And you'll see some of that, hopefully, as I talk to you. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about ERDC itself, and I'll try not to repeat everything Patty said, to sort of set the conditions, and then talk to you about the Corps of Engineers and the challenges we're facing. Then I'm going to slip into, I think this workshop is on resiliency, so I'll talk to you about some ideas on resiliency and what we're doing to participate in resiliency. I do not claim to be the expert on resiliency. We actually had a workshop at Ole Miss, University of Mississippi, just a couple of weeks ago where we talked about this issue as well. So some of you perhaps actually have spent a career researching resiliency. Again, I'll defer to you, your expertise. But some concepts, you know, we work on the military side of things. We are the Army Corps of Engineers, and we do a lot of civil works things. You'll see more about that in just a minute. So there's a lot of issues, that national security level issues, that we impact in what we do in the Army Corps of Engineers and in the ERDC every day. I'll start by explaining my job. So Simon talked about me being the director of ERDC. Okay, I became that almost exactly a year ago, by the way. Last week, I think, was my 1 year anniversary. Seems like it was just yesterday. So I'm the director of ERDC, so I lead these great laboratories for the Corps of Engineers, but I'm also the director of research and development for the Army Corps of Engineers. That's a slight difference. So I work directly for the chief in that capacity, and it's a small office in Washington, D.C. I'm up there about half the time. I sort of live in the Hilton, Crystal City, about half the time, it seems like. And so in that role, I sort of direct the policy and oversight and the chief scientist, ironically, I'm an engineer, not a scientist, but the chief science advisor, I guess you'd say, for the chief of engineers for the entire regiment. So I have that couple of capacities when I think about resiliency on behalf of the Army Corps of Engineers. I'll start with Corps of Engineers at large. We've been around since 1775. Right? We joined George Washington as he was trying to, with his ragtag army he was creating back in 1775 to fight the world's greatest fighting force at the time, the British. And we won, of course, and established this great nation. But we've been doing our mission ever since, starting in that fighting force and helped establish fortifications. There were military engineers, as you probably really know this, before there were civil engineers, right? And so we actually helped build this country. We helped build the highways. The rivers were the original interstate highways. We helped build the fortifications. And so all the way up to this day, we have the military mission. You see up in the corner there. So we still have that military mission. That, the chief engineer is the chief engineer for the Army. He's a 3-star general. So we do military construction for the Army and the Air Force, for instance. That's billions of dollars a year. That total program is about $24 billion. Then you go to that middle piece on the top, that's our civil works mission. So we still have that to this day. That's about $6 billion a year. So we're actually in charge of our nation's waterways, making them navigable. We have an environmental mission to make sure that the impacts of what we do doesn't impact the environment too bad. So we have a flood and coastal risk reduction. When storms hit, how do we help mitigate the damage associated with storms and other natural disasters? And that's a lot about the resiliency story I'll tell you today. Then we have our contingency operations mission. We do a lot of work with FEMA. Somebody was talking about FEMA this morning. We have emergency support functions for FEMA to respond to natural disasters, debris removal, and we're actually down in Puerto Rico right now helping to restore power there after the devastating Hurricane Maria last fall. They almost lost all of the power on the island, and now it's been restored to about 95% of the power to this day, and we'll stay there hopefully to the end, but it's at least at 95% now. We have a international interagency mission. That means we work for others, okay? So we work for just about every other federal agency out there that has any kind of engineering needs. For instance, right now, the Corps of Engineers is building, for the VA, a lot of hospitals. A lot of veterans are getting older, they need more hospitals, and so we have that on a reimbursable basis for the VA. We work for Department of State, EPA, a lot of agencies out there, and hundreds of countries, over 100 countries worldwide, allies, of course, where we have a strategic interest. Then we have, so the Chief of Engineers is the Army's topographer, map maker. We've had that mission again. We helped map this country since the 1800s and still have that mission today on the battlefields. So you don't have Google Map for the center of, say, the Hindu Kush Mountains in Afghanistan, okay? So how do we create that situational awareness for the warfighter so he can make decisions? Where's the enemy? Where do I need to go? And sensing and understanding what the enemy is. And then finally, R&D in the corner. That's me. That's us here at the ERDC primarily. And we have other research groups, smaller research groups in the Corps of Engineers as well. So all that together is a big old mission of the Corps of Engineers. It's about 35,000 people now, 95% civilians, by the way. So when I got a job offer from the Army Corps of Engineers in 1983, I said, I don't want to join the Army. Well, most of the Corps of Engineers are civilians. Okay, I just didn't know that. And to this day, we have a 3-star general ahead of us. We divide the country into 9 pieces called divisions. They're headed by 2-star generals. Each division will have 3 to 6 districts. Those will be headed by colonels. And that's just about all of it. The military, and the rest of us are just about civilians. There's a group of 249th Prime Power that actually does electrical response and things, but we're mostly civilians. So the ERDC, as again, Patty sort of gave you this little overview here, but we actually started at ERDC in 1929 after the Great Flood of 1927. Remember, we were kind of the nation's engineer since its beginning. And so when the Great Flood of 1927, which pretty much flooded on the Mississippi River from St. Louis all the way down to Louisiana. For instance, right here at Vicksburg, the river was 80 miles wide from here to Monroe, Louisiana. Thousands of people displaced, millions, billions probably in today's dollars damage. And so the country didn't really have an adequate response at that time. We didn't have the systems. We didn't have a FEMA back then. And so Herbert Hoover, I think he might have been Secretary of Commerce at the time, but he was a national leader on responding after World War I. He did a lot in Europe. So how could we come up with a way of responding to these floods? And so the Corps of Engineers, that nation's engineer, was given this mission, figure out a way to help mitigate these floods. And so the Waterways Experiment Station was born in 1929 right here in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Well, why Vicksburg of all places? Well, on the Mississippi River, if you go to the river, you'll look and you'll see how high we are above the river itself. We never flooded here in the flood of 27. Actually, in the Civil War, it was called the Gibraltar of the South because there was a great bend in the Mississippi River here, and it was easy to defend the river there. The siege of Vicksburg sort of stopped that. That put U.S. Grant on the map in the Civil War. But anyway, so we were born here, created the laboratories, and we had that Civil Works mission in the beginning. When the World War II hit, we got a military mission, and I haven't looked back since. In the 70s, we got an environmental laboratory as the environmental laws came in place. In the 60s, there was a lot of Cold War fever, so the Co-Regents Lab was born in the New England. A lot of military installations needed research, so the SERL was born in Illinois. That map-making mission has been going on since at least World War II from a research standpoint. So we were all pulled together in something called the ERDC in about 1999. There were 4 different commands in the 4 states. So today we're 7 laboratories in 4 states, as Patty reviewed with you. And if you look at the name of the labs, the Coastal Hydraulics Lab, that's that original mission. Geotech and Structures Lab, that's where I came from. Information Technology Lab, you're in it right now. Environmental Lab. That's kind of the expertise associated with the people that work in them. The programs that we lead aren't, necessarily environmental lab programs or information technology lab programs. The laboratories house the expertise. The programs are pretty much ERDC or maybe Army or DoD wide. So our leadership, I just put this chart up here to tell you that since I started about a little over a year ago, almost all of our leaders are changing. I'm just like, why's everybody leaving? But it's a huge turnover in senior executives in the Army right now. They're shifting around. I think the Navy does a similar thing, and the Air Force does a similar thing. The Army, from our leadership, says, hey, if you're a senior executive in the Army and you've been in a position more than 7 years, you need to find something else to do. And so our lab directors tend to be in place a long, long time, and so some of them shifted seats. So Dr. Beth Fleming, my deputy now, used to be the director of the environmental lab. Ilker Ida Gazelle, in Champaign, Illinois, is now the director of the environmental lab. Some of them switched seats. Some of them are recruiting now. As Patty just said, Reed Moser, the director of ITL, just retired, and so we're recruiting that director. We're recruiting one in Champaign, Illinois. So we're recruiting a lot of directors. Some are acting directors now. So we're in a big state of change in the ERDC itself, in our leadership, starting with me a year ago. But the good news is we're getting excellent leaders in place. We have a huge, amazing talent pool to recruit from. And it's exciting to see this shift as we go forward, as new missions and challenges face us. So talking about those new missions and challenges, our secret to our success, I think, is our people. They're passionate about what they do. We got a lot of engineers and scientists, over 2,000 people that work in ERDC today. Over half of those, about 55%, are engineers and scientists. 3/4 of those have some kind of graduate degree, a master's or a PhD. And by the way, we pay for a lot of those degrees. So we believe in really developing our workforce on 2 fronts. A technical front, so we really invest heavily. For instance, I got my master's degree right here in Vicksburg on the Waterways Experiment Station in the 80s. We have a building to this day that's still there. It's called the Graduate Institute. So people who work here become adjunct faculty members to Mississippi State, LSU, Texas A&M, whoever are members of the Graduate Institute. They teach on their behalf. You matriculate through their system, and I got my master's degree while working full-time in about 5 years. A lot of us, perhaps in this room, are doing that or have done that. Then I went off to University of Texas in the 90s. That's the cherry program right there. There you go. Texas, we got a Longhorn. There's another Longhorn. Hey, Longhorn's in the, so I got to go there 89, 90 academic year, came back, did my research, actually finished and graduated in 93. A lot of folks don't end up finishing, just like any other graduate program. They don't actually quite finish yet. So I finished in 93. So a lot of people do that. So we invest heavily in technical training. But look at this bimodal age distribution right here. I put that up there just to show you, like 55% of our people are engineers and scientists, but the other 45% are either administrative personnel or technicians, but all of them have a similar age distribution. If you look at the group on this side, that's the baby boomers and older, say 50 and older. I'm in that group. It was the largest group at ERDC just a few years ago, but now look, we've been recruiting like crazy because we didn't recruit for a long time. And now the single largest group at ERDC is the millennials, Gen Xers, 35 and younger. And you'll look around here and you'll see a lot of new faces in the room, and that's great. That's vibrancy. They bring a lot of creativity and expertise and that we've never had before. But that creates a challenge for us now, because as we walk out the door, the baby boomer generation with a lot of experience and not many years left, we're trying to train the younger folks in leadership development training. And so we got a robust leadership development program right now, and they're going to be leading this place in about 5 or 10 years. We'll see branch chiefs, and we're seeing them right now in their 20s. We'll see division chiefs in their 30s. We'll see senior executives in their 40s. That's radically different than the generation I came up in. And so we're training them like crazy, both on the technical side and on the leadership side. I think this is not ERDC-centric, by the way, as maybe the DOE is the same way, and other organizations. Y'all see the same kind of thing happening. So it's an exciting transition, I think, for all of us. And I'm so excited about our future because of the quality of leaders that we're grooming and hiring today. So we have a lot of partnerships. I think Patty touched on this as well. You know, we don't do it all ourselves, obviously. We have a lot of partnerships inside the Department of Defense. We work with all the services, the DoD itself, work with Department of Energy, Department of State. I told you about those interagency relationships that we have across the ERDC and across the Corps. We do about $1 billion a year in the ERDC. About a third of that is what we call our direct program, RDT&E, things that come through the Pentagon. And then the rest are what we call reimbursable or work with others, to more project-specific type work. We have a lot of work with industry. We did over $160 million just out of this office in ERDC last year with industry partners that actually transition that technology and make the things that we do. We couldn't do our work without them. And then finally, academia. If any of you guys are in research and development, many of you are, you know we can't do what we do without academia. We come from academia. We're not the smartest on every topic. We know that. So we reach out to those who are to help us do what we do every day. So we talked about business areas, I think, earlier, or research areas. If you look at everything we do in ERDC, you can divide it into 5 pieces. Business areas, research areas, call it what you want. You could do this 100 different ways, but we just call these 5 areas. 4 of these are military related. It's kind of the proportion of the work that we have. We're about 75–80% military funded. And so from military engineering, where we blow things up, we love to see blast and weapons effects on buildings and structures above the ground and below the ground. Force projection is airfields and pavements and ports. That's my personal technical background. Maneuver support, finding tunnels underground. That's a huge mission for us, for instance. Geospatial research and engineering. I talked earlier about that. That's map making on steroids. It's maps where there are no maps. It's helping the soldier, all the way from the soldier all the way up to strategic engagements in the Pacific Theater, for instance. How do you do the sensing and the accumulation of that knowledge for a commander to make a decision, or even a soldier to make a decision? Environmental quality and installations. That's where we're trying to make our infrastructure and installations, our military installations, more efficient, resilient, sustainable. How do we reduce water demand, energy demand? How do we make it world-class training facilities for our soldiers who are going to go out there and fight for us? Now we're translating a lot of that knowledge to the battlefield itself. Engineer resilience system. Patty talked a lot about that. That's our newest business area. It's only about a year or so old, but it's leveraging that great supercomputing capability and knowledge we have just right through that wall right there, a few of the fastest supercomputers in the world. And what we bring to that, what the ERDC brings to that, is the knowledge of the environment, the water, the air, the ground, the interaction. We don't build the tanks, but the tank builders come to us and can put it in this virtual world, this virtual prototyping, and we can do some trade space analytics. Y'all probably know all about that, but we can look at thousands of variants of that tank. They're the experts, and we put it in our environment. And the whole idea is, right now we're going through these things called modernization priorities in the Army, where our tank we have today was first built and conceived almost 50 years ago, right? And we've done some upgrades, but we haven't had any major upgrades in decades. And so how do we crunch the time from conception of an idea, of a new tank, a new airplane, a new ship, from 30 years from conception to fielding to maybe 15 years or 10 years? We can do that if we do a lot of the work up front, modeling, before we bend the first piece of metal. That's the whole idea. And then finally, civil works. I'll spend more time of that towards the end of the presentation, but that's that civil works function that we have, making sure our waterways are navigable, that flood and coastal risk reduction, and then impacts on the environment itself. So let me talk about I'll talk about the military a little bit before I dive into civil works. So about 70–80% of what we do is military related in the ERDC. And right now the Army is focused on what is called its modernization priorities. So the Chief of Staff of the Army and the Secretary of the Army have identified 6 modernization priorities. And they're fairly simple to think about it, complicated to figure out, but they want a next generation combat vehicle, for instance, a new tank, if you will. They want a new future vertical lift, a new helicopter, if you will, new air missile defense systems, AMD we call it, new long-range precision fires, that's the guns, that's artillery, it's got to shoot a long way. Okay, new soldier lethality, think of weapons, that's to make the soldier more lethal, and I'm forgetting one of them. So we participate in ERDC in 5 of these 6, and then we do some things that are what we call cross-cutting, that don't fit necessarily within those specific priority areas, but it supports all of them. So if you think about, this is a graphic of going into a theater of operations, for instance. How do you get into the theater itself? The ports you might have to build because the enemy isn't going to let you use their nice shiny port. You have to use an old one or build your own. Fly into an airfield that doesn't exist, you got to build it or upgrade one. Move through the lines of communication, the roads, the bridges, the gaps, off-road, on-road. How do you get into where the enemy is and engage them? A lot of times they'll pull you into the city, the mega city, where they have an advantage. Fighting in urban areas is not a huge strength of ours, and so we're trying to develop that capability. How do you have situational awareness in complex and urban terrain? Subterranean, how do you look underground? Where are they? Because they'll go underground because they know they have an advantage there. They'll shoot back at us, okay? And so how do we protect our critical assets now that what we thought was safe, like Guam, 10 years ago or 20 years ago, isn't quite safe anymore. And so how do we protect assets that we thought were safe just by distance, virtue of distance just a few years ago? And so how do we do these kind of things? Well, that's what the engineers bring. Whether you move, shoot, sustain, protect, in the theater of operations, the engineers are going to be all over it. So now let me switch to a little bit to civil works. So the civil works mission is huge when you think about it. The reason we have a civil works mission is because it's so vital to our national security and our economy. If you think about it, about a quarter of our GDP every year passes through our ports, either imports or exports every year. About 50% of our GDP is associated with what's called the ocean corridors, 50 or 100 miles inland, where about 50% of our population now lives next to the coast, or even offshore, fishing, tourism, oil. If you think about that sector, that ocean corridor, that's about half of our GDP. And so the things that we do with our infrastructure, that's literally the foundation of most of our GDP. That's what kind of we're responsible for. Not just us, but we got a key part of that. Certainly the ports and the waterways piece of it and the coastal areas, that's what we impact every day. And so that's the value that just the Corps of Engineers Civil Works mission brings to us every day. But we got a lot of challenges, of course. Look at our infrastructure. We talk a lot about our roads, our bridges, our locks, our dams, our levees, aging infrastructure. A lot of this was built in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Design lives as civil engineers we know are 20 years for a road or an airfield, or 50 years for a dam. Well, they're way past their original design life, and they're breaking all the heck and back. Everybody knows this. The president's actually made it a key part of his agenda to help try to fix this. The bill right now is estimated for all infrastructure, not just the Corps, $4 or $5 trillion. Okay, that's several times our GDP. And the president's proposing about $1.5 trillion at least. That's a lot more than has been proposed in the past. We're trying to get after that. And so the role of the Corps is to help put that in place in an innovative way. The role of R&D is to help come up with the ways of making that $1 we have against a $100 problem be worth at least $3 or $4, okay, against that $100 problem. And that's what we strive to do every day. Plus, try to reduce the impacts on the environment. We got increasing water demands. You see droughts all the time in the West as we grow our population and the water goes down. Even in the Southeast, my in-laws are from Atlanta, Georgia. Until just very recently, they were on, drought. You couldn't water your yard and that kind of thing. And so there's water demands, there's energy demands, there's demands that we're putting on our environment around us. And yet we have one of the highest quality lives in the world. So how do we sustain that over time? How do we become resilient when something hits us and we have to respond back? That's our role. And so shifting into resiliency now. So this conversation has been going on for a long time. And even recently, with the previous administration, you see with the 4 circles there, they started defining resiliency as it really became important after Hurricane Katrina. That really put resiliency of our infrastructure on the map when we saw the devastation that happened in New Orleans, for instance, and on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Billions of dollars in damage, thousands of lives, unfortunately, were lost. And so how do you define it? And so we started coming up with definitions in 2013. On this side over here, the circles, prepare and anticipate, there's components of resiliency. Then the lightning bolt, the yellow lightning bolt there represents the actual event, whether it's a natural disaster or a man-made disaster. Then ability to resist and absorb whatever happened. The ability to recover and then bounce back. and finally the ability to adapt and resolve. And so the next time it hits, hopefully you're more prepared for it. Even more recently though, back in December, there was a national security study published that talked about resiliency in broader terms. If you see, it not only talks about disasters, both man-made and natural disasters, but it talks about unconventional stresses, shocks and threats to our economic and democratic systems. So it's a broader definition of resiliency. So bottom line, it's how can we take a hit and how can we respond back? And if you can respond very quickly, you're highly resilient. If you can't respond quickly or any at all, you're not very resilient. So, and we obviously want to be resilient. So we got a lot of research in a lot of areas. I'll talk a little bit about the military side here again, and this switch mostly in the civil works side. But if you think about in the area of preparation, all of our modeling that we do, if we can understand what the impacts of Hurricane Katrina are going to be before Hurricane Katrina hits, New Orleans and South Mississippi, we can prepare much better for it. Our energy production and conservation areas on our installations, try to reduce that demand signal, understand what it is before we can reduce it. Virtual prototyping, we talked about in our engineer resilient systems. How do we build those platforms much faster, cheaper, and better than ever before? On the recovery side, how do we model what's out there? How do we have our 24/7 operations that we have. It's called the USACE Reachback Operations Center. So we can respond to missions around the world through satellite reachback capability to specific questions that happen in military operations and post-disaster type response. On the adaptation side, how do we come up with ways, sustainable repair methods for our bridges, for instance, that we have. We have a lot of bridges on military installations. That's our interest. So how do we protect our structures against attack? We talked about that blast and weapons effects expertise we have here. We actually put a lot of our technology, coincidentally, in the walls of the Pentagon, and we were in the process of doing that when the airplane hit the Pentagon on 9/11. So the reason we were doing that, they were doing something called the Pentagon Renovation Project in the late 90s. The Pentagon was built by the Corps of Engineers, World War II, did it in about a year. And it was a fine building, concrete building for about 50 years. And finally they said, well, we need to update this place. By then we knew that there were terrorists out there that would attack us in a lot of ways, like truck bombs and big other means of attack. And so we had been studying that since the 80s, since the bombs attacked the Marine barracks in Beirut, Lebanon. And so we were looking at ways of hardening buildings against asymmetric threats, we call it. So that technology was being built into the walls of the Pentagon for truck bombs, okay? That was considered the threat. And it had been done one wedge at a time, so 1/5 at a time. And the last wedge had not been completed yet when the airplane hit. And it just so happened to hit right between an area that had been retrofitted with this technology on the exterior walls and the side that had not been yet retrofitted. So the terrorists were, not good people, but they were fairly smart in terms of how they were going to attack, because they took long flights, so the wings were full of jet fuel. They were like truck bombs, okay? So when they hit the Pentagon, the fuselage, of course, it wasn't designed to withstand a fuselage, that physical damage that was caused. It penetrated about 3 rings in the Pentagon. But when the wings blew up, they were like truck bombs blowing up. So fortunately, the technology that was built into the walls of the Pentagon, it actually prevented a lot of deaths on the side where the wing blew up, and it had been retrofitted. Nobody was killed in that side. On the other side that had not been retrofitted yet, a lot of people were killed. I think over 160 people were killed total. So we feel grateful that at least our technology benefited some folks on this side. And since then, a lot of buildings in the DC area and really in embassies around the world have been retrofitted with this technology. That really inspires us. It gives us motivation to do what we do every day when we know we have that kind of impact. So this is the only geeky slide I guess I'll show you, but it's another way of describing resiliency. If you think about functionality on the vertical axis over time, if a city, a facility, or anything is, say, 100% functional, then a disaster hits. Okay, then how do you prepare for that? And then how does it degrade the functionality? Then how does it respond with time? If it takes years like it did in New Orleans, they're still recovering actually. And then how do they adapt and evolve so that the next time a disaster hits, it isn't quite as bad in terms of the degradation in function, and it can respond quicker. That's a more resilient system now. That area under that curve, in that bowl at least, if it gets smaller with time, that's a more resilient system. So that's the goal here really, is coming up with a system that can respond that well with time. And hopefully that blip gets smaller and smaller and smaller with time. That's the goal of what we're trying to achieve in resiliency. So there's a lot of things when you think about resiliency, you got to take into the context of what does the community want? Okay, if you think about a hurricane, for instance, and you think about two cities, New York City, for instance, Manhattan particularly, the financial capital of the world. If they got a square inch of space of shore to do something with, they're going to build a skyscraper on it, okay? They want every square inch of land they can get. So to get protection, they say, just put me a seawall up there, just give me that extra land. And they've actually built out some land since the island itself was developed. And so that's their approach to getting resiliency, build me a seawall. Okay, and it kind of works for them. Go to Miami Beach though, totally different culture, right? They got their skyscrapers, but they love their beach. It's in their name, Miami Beach. They understand tourism. They understand, this is what they're all about. And so they'll get that resiliency, but they'll do it with a beach. Okay, it has that standoff of the hurricanes. It reduces the wave heights and that sort of thing. And they can get a similar amount of resiliency, but with a totally different approach to it. So you always consider the local needs of the community in building this in. Nags Head is off the coast of North Carolina. How do they get their resiliency? Well, it's obviously a resort area, a lot of private homes there, a lot of tourism spots there. They were losing their beach, in 2011 after a series of hurricanes. The Corps of Engineers, one of our functions is working with the local communities on a cost share basis to help restore the beach. Get that, what we call sediment, the sand that goes out into the ocean with time, and put it back on the beach, so restore the beach. We did that a couple of years ago, and now they've restored their resiliency of those communities just using the natural sand in the beaches. So I'll give you some examples then related to our navigation mission of how we're helping to build in resiliency. One of those 4 circles I talked about earlier. There's different approaches to getting the resiliency. I'll talk to you about navigation. I'll give you an example in flood risk management, in the environmental side, and our emergency management side. Starting with navigation. So I'm a civil engineer, so I understand this part. So when we have hundreds of locks and dams on our nation's rivers, Ohio River, Mississippi River, Missouri River, Columbia River, that we're responsible for. And those locks, as I said, most of them are older than me, okay? I mean, they've been around a long, long time, and we do a great job of keeping these old gates, mostly steel gates, operating, and we oil them, and we maintain them, and we weld them, and we do all this kind of stuff. But when they break down, it's like shutting down an interstate highway, okay? And it doesn't take much for these things to break. They can get slightly off the hinge, or a member can break, and it becomes very unsafe. And so we got to thinking a few years ago, it's much less expensive to fix it, and it's a much lower impact on the economy, on the throughput of that interstate, so to speak, that river, if we can fix it when we want to fix it versus fixing it when we have to fix it. Think of that little light that comes up on your dash when you're driving in your car, okay? When it flashes engine light, oil change needed, I'd rather spend $40 to get that oil change now than $3,000 to replace that engine because I ignored it, right? So we said, let's put that same concept then on our locks and dams and put this sensors on the gates. We do finite element modeling here in our supercomputers and say, what are the things we need to look for? Okay, if it strains this much, does that mean it's going to break? Yes or no. Then we just make it real simple for the lock operator. This person there might not have a college degree, but is an expert on that lock, and make it red, amber, green. Say, hey, if it gets amber, you better start looking at it. If it's red, you really need to start shutting things down and fix it, or it's going to just break on you. So those kind of systems we're putting in place now to make our whole lock system and navigation system more resilient. So when we think about how we respond to flood and coastal risk reduction, Hurricane Katrina was probably the greatest. It sort of set the new mark for impacts of disasters of this country. The state of Louisiana and New Orleans specifically was devastated, of course, but also the Mississippi Gulf Coast. We were right behind them in terms of amount of damage and billions of dollars lost and hundreds of lives lost. And so our approach in Mississippi has been something called the Mississippi Coastal Improvement Program, or MISSIP. It's a non-structural response, really. So in New Orleans, we actually rebuilt the eye walls that were formed along London Avenue Canal and 17th Street Canal that were supposed to take the water out of New Orleans and put it into Lake Pontchartrain. We literally rebuilt those levee systems much more robust than ever before. But here, the non-structural approach, not rebuilding a levee or a flood wall, is actually looking at how nature can help us a little bit. If we understand how far the water came in, how far the 100-year flood would hit, and we look at preserving those areas and not necessarily rebuilding back in those areas, or if we do build in those areas, we build our structures much stronger than ever before. So it's a much more non-structural approach on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, a much larger area along there, say, than New Orleans. So there's all kinds of ways of approaching these problems. Those studies, though, help us do this much smarter than we've ever done it before. You can't just build a wall everywhere. On the environmental side, now we've got a lot of examples, but I picked this one because it's a good example of showing how our military work, which is about 70–80% of what we do, can be applied to civil problems, and it goes the other way too. Sometimes we'll come up with a solution on the civil side and we'll apply it back to a military problem. And you think, well, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is, if you think about it, on the military side, it's just two entirely different environments you're working in. On the military side, you're fighting a war, okay. Money's really not a huge object. Speed is, somebody's shooting at me, I gotta do this fast, and quality is good enough. It might have to last a month. It don't have to last 50 years. On the civil side, I don't have enough money. It's gotta last 50 to 100 years, and quality has gotta be premium, okay? And so it's two different sides of the brain that's kind of working there. But sometimes having people that think this way applied to these problems can give you a really different perspective, and vice versa. So here's an example. So we came up with this biopolymer because we had dust problems when helicopters land in dusty areas like Iraq or Afghanistan. And when they do that, that's bad. Okay, when they land and all this dust kicks up, it's bad for the motor, it's bad for the pilot, people crash, it's dangerous for the operations, it tells the enemy where I am. Hey, if you didn't know where I was, look at that big dust cloud. So bad, bad, bad. We needed to mitigate the dust. And it's kind of expensive to do that with normal procedures. Well, we came up with this biopolymer that you basically spray out on the ground, and it helps pack the dust in, and it also helps, and we didn't know this side effect, it helps plants grow like crazy. We didn't know that. It's a side benefit. And so we started exploiting that. And if you look at the graphs up here, we actually planted some grass or different plants, and we looked at the root ball up under it after we sprayed this biopolymer on it. And the part that hadn't been treated had root balls this big. When you spray it with this stuff, it's like putting Miracle-Gro on it, man. I mean, it's just, the root ball was huge. It just dramatically increased the root ball. So we said, let's put that on a levee. A lot of our levees are made out of sediments, mud that comes out when we dredge things out, soil. Okay, and so we get it compacted and build the levee, and we spray this biopolymer on there. It makes a fantastic vegetation system. It's sustainable then. It helps keep it from, solves two problems. It helps preserve the structural integrity of the levee itself, and it also helps the sediment from going back into the water, into the stream, and going back out. We have to dredge it back out again. So, I mean, a very innovative application of a technology meant for another purpose to solve a civil works problem. I think my final example here is on the emergency management side. So we have, again, official missions from FEMA that we do on emergency management. But a lot of the things that we help make our coastal areas more resilient is we actually do surveys, LIDAR type surveys of our entire coastal areas with airplanes that we actually own and operate. They get that physical measurements of the elevations, for instance, of the coastline itself, which is constantly changing. It's a very dynamic environment. The beaches move, the sandbars move, and you have to get that fairly precise measurement of the coastal areas, because when you model them, that has everything to do with how big the waves are and where the water's going to move and that sort of thing. I mean, if it was just static, if it never changed, we wouldn't have to measure all the time. So you have to measure it, get these data in, and then since Hurricane Katrina we learned Do those calculations of the impacts of the hurricane before the hurricane hits, because you don't have 2 weeks to study a hurricane when it's hitting tomorrow. So do all these. So we did these thousands of runs, literally, with these computers right here. And we measured the impact of this terrain with the waves and the water, measured the surge heights with some certainties and probabilities associated with it. So now we have all this data created by these computer models, validated by hurricanes and floods that we've seen since then. So we can much more quickly, in hours, not days, see what the impact of a hurricane will be before it hits. So we can prepare and respond much quicker. And now that we know these things are going to hit where they're going to hit, Hurricane Sandy, for instance, hit later. So now we've done this so FEMA's paid us actually to go back and look at areas along the Atlantic coast. We still haven't done Florida for some strange reason. We've done most of the Gulf Coast. We're looking at Alaska and Hawaii as well, even in the Great Lakes region that we help manage as well. So it helps us in a lot of ways, not just respond to that emergency itself, but look at how we can fortify the permanent infrastructure we have to be more effective and more resilient with time. I want to throw this research idea out to you. It's a concept, really. It's not a program yet. Maybe it will be one day. But it's a framework I like to think about when we think about how we approach these huge civil war problems we have. And you can see the ideas of resiliency built into this idea. But it's called the UPS strategy. Y'all heard of UPS? The brown trucks, we deliver stuff. So it helps me remember what this is about. This isn't delivery stuff. This is delivering knowledge, I guess. But UPS stands for understand, predict, and shape. It's a real simple idea. But it's the 3 key components to coming up with a complete knowledge and shaping of what you're going to do. So start with understand. How do we understand completely? If you own the Mississippi River, if you're the Mississippi Valley Division Commander here, 2-star General right here in Vicksburg, and you have your area of operation, your responsibility is the entire Mississippi Valley, from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, how do you understand perfectly situational awareness all the time? Where's the water? Where's the seepage under the levee, the part that you can't see? What is the state? What's the condition of everything right now? Just think about that data acquisition problem. You get pieces of the data in critical areas right now, but perfect situational awareness all the time. These things are changing all the time. Think of the data challenges you'd have there, the big data challenges you'd have, the data analytics challenges, the visualization type challenges you would have. That's $50 million, 50 PhDs right there, all by itself. And I think that's a fraction of the real cost. That's a big study area that Patty talked about earlier. It's big for the entire United States, but that's just step one. Totally understanding what is today. Now then it's like, so what? Where do we go from here? Well, that's where prediction comes in. What's going to happen tomorrow? What's going to happen 5 minutes from now, 5 days from now, 5 weeks, 5 years, 500 years from now? Okay, that's where, and we love modeling. That's us. Modeling are us. So we can predict the impacts of these storms that we talked about. We can see how these levees are going to perform. We can see how this gate is going to perform over time with some uncertainty, because all the models, of course, have uncertainty from the model itself or from the data that we get from step one to go in it, okay? But once you can understand everything, predict everything, which is $50 more million and 50 more PhDs at least, within the so what piece comes in. How do you shape the future, shape the outcome? So now that I know that Hurricane Katrina, is the impacts it's going to have, I can predict 5 years before it happens that these two canals here are going to flood, and billions of dollars of damage is going to happen, and it's going to kill 2,000 people. I know that 5 years before it happens. What can I do about it? Can I create an early warning system that makes everybody get out? Can I create a better levee and build it now, spend a couple of billion versus 100 billion to fix it? So shaping the outcome is all about those mitigation techniques that a lot of spend of our time on right now. A new design, a new material, a new method, a new technique. But really, in my opinion, it takes all 3. If you do all 3 of those well, you're doing the kind of service that we need to do to this nation. You're building in resilience almost automatically. Just think what you can do with a system like this. This is still a concept. It's a framework for thinking about how we approach research and development in the Corps of Engineers on our civil works side. And it actually goes to our military mission as well. I'm just using civil works as an example. So a way to think about resilience as we go forward. I think that's my last slide, but I just want to tell you that in ERDC, we say that we discover, develop, and deliver what Patty talked about, new ways to make the world safer and better every day. That's what turns us on. I mean, it inspires us, you know. We might not pay the most in the world. We actually pay pretty well for Mississippi and where our labs are located. But that's not why we work here. We work because we make a difference in the world every day. And so I welcome you again to the ERDC. I hope you get a chance to see our organization, our town, our local community. And thank you for being here. I'm delighted to be part of your workshop, and I appreciate the invitation.